My name is Lisa Flaherty, and I'm interviewing Monica Miller for Georgia State University's Women March Oral History Project. The date is the 2nd of March, and the interview is taking place at Georgia College in Milledgeville. All right, as I said, we're going to start kind of chronologically. Feel free to come and go. If you need to move forward and backwards, that's fine. It's no big deal. I'm going to ask what year you were born. Don't give me any other information in case somebody's reading this. I don't want to steal your identity. So that said, what year were you born, Monica?
1974.
And where were you born?
San Antonio, Texas.
So did you have a big family, small family?
Parents and one brother who's 6 years younger than me.
Can you describe your family's political leanings?
Sure, yeah. My parents both raised me very conservative Republican. My father was very proud of his Olive North haircut. In the 80s, he referred to his business account as his Ollie North account. That was kind of his identity at the time.
So politics were discussed?
Politics were discussed. We went through kind of my dad was in the military when I was born. He got out when I was 4, and we moved to California in the 70s, where he worked in computers. And while they were very conservative for California, I think that California in the 70s still had somewhat of an effect on them. My mother wrote letters in protest of threatened malathion spraying at the time. But then we moved to Georgia when I was 7, and I grew up primarily in the suburbs of Atlanta, the growing suburbs of Atlanta in the 80s. And my dad continued to work with computers. We went to the Methodist Church. They were still pretty middle-of-the-road conservative. I do often kind of joke that the fact that I started kindergarten in California in the 70s and my brother started kindergarten in Atlanta in the 80s is why we're so very different politically and culturally and in all sorts of ways like that.
So you said your father was in the, I guess the very beginnings of this explosion of computers and technology. Do you think that played a part or at all in his thinking? Because there's some very different parts of the world.
Yeah.
Parts of the nation, rather.
Well, in the military, he worked, he did like anti-Russian kind of work in electronic warfare and things like that. In California, he was at GTE, and I don't really know what kind of effect that had. In Georgia, he worked primarily at Georgia Tech in research, but also it was primarily military contracts. In the 1980s, he worked on the Pavlov helicopter. He worked on the night vision goggles. So it was very much. On the one hand, I always think of how like Reagan's America, is what put food on the table in a lot of that. So it was very much, what's his name? The guy who wrote like Tom Clancy novels are kind of like my dad's vision of the world.
So voting, was that how did your family approach voting? Was it discussed?
It was discussed. I would go with my parents to vote. I think in 1980, my dad may have voted for Carter, which in retrospect is kind of bizarre. But they were very pro-Reagan, pro-Bush, and my mother admired Nancy Reagan, my mother admired Barbara Bush.
Now, does your brother or any of your other family members participate in politics?
My brother's wife is actually a pretty outspoken Democrat. Her family's a pretty outspoken Democrat. Her mother's on city council in Lexington. I think Amanda rebels against her parents by being a little bit more conservative, actually. And so she and my brother, she will be somewhat vocally outspoken. They live in Ohio now. They live in Dayton, Ohio. Amanda's family's Catholic. My brother became Catholic when they got married. Their kids go to Catholic school. So, and my brother is a lawyer and has his own firm. And so in that respect, they're both pretty quiet and not that politically active. They're active in things like junior league and boards and things like that. But, and Amanda certainly will express her opinions. My brother being a lawyer and also just being a little bit more conservative than we are will just be more quiet.
So discussions happen easily around the table when you're all together?
We aren't all together
Oh.
that much. My parents got divorced in 1992. Interestingly, my dad went even more my dad went more conservative. He went like Church of God, foot washing, Church of God. My mother went Episcopalian. But in the time since then, weirdly enough, my mother has continued to be more conservative. Her church in northern Georgia does the Hell House sorts of things at Halloween, where they show you all the ways that you can go to hell in an attempt to convert people to Christianity. My father's most recent, he's on his fourth wife, and this wife is Catholic and is very liberal, and he suddenly has come out as a liberal. And when I saw him last, he started mansplaining to me how important Hillary Clinton was, which was really, really funny to me. He's like, we need to vote for Hillary Clinton, because then my brother's like, is he explaining like Hillary Clinton to you? I'm like, yeah, he is. So yeah, weirdly enough, my dad is now Mr. Liberal. My mother is still, doesn't express her opinions, although in the past couple of years she will occasionally tell me that I need to stop being so loudly political because it's upsetting her husband. And I will say, well, then he can stop following me on Facebook. I'm not going to stop.
Mm-hmm.
She just tries to keep the peace and knows better than to. The couple of times that she's tried to have a political opinion around me and I will tell her what I think, then she just tries to keep the peace. So yeah, we've gone through some really weird twists and turns the past 30 years.
That's what family is.
Mm-hmm.
How they run. So we talked about it a little bit before, but can you tell me about your profession? Maybe your favorite parts of the job, your least favorite parts of the job?
Sure. So I'm an assistant professor of English at Middle Georgia State University. This is my second year at Middle Georgia State in Macon, Georgia. I love teaching. I love research. I teach English and professional writing and literature. I write primarily about Southern literature. I also am very interested in the scholarship of teaching and learning as well. So, how do we learn? How do I as a teacher facilitate learning in my students and the wonderful give and take that happens in my own understanding of what I'm doing is just wonderful. And so something that has been very important to me is we were talking about getting students into the archive, getting students doing field research, understanding credibility of sources continues to be so and so important. And I think that getting students' hands dirty, right? Like this is what let's look at these newspapers, let's go interview people, has been a really wonderful experience. It's turned into the last couple of years, I taught a class about Middle Georgia that I called, there's a Mab Seacrest used to be a Georgia college, wrote an article called The Georgia Surreal about why do we have people like Flannery O'Connor and Jean Toomer and Alice Walker and St. Ohm and these just really weird artists in Middle Georgia. And she coined this term called the Georgia Surreal. And so I taught a themed summer class and we went around from place to place and it really turned into a question, this was just last summer, of what's the purpose of commemoration? What do we commemorate and why? And this continues to be something. This fall, my students are going to be doing a class themed around King's letter from a Birmingham jail. We're going to do archival research at Washington Memorial Library about that. And again, what is it that we commemorate? What are we doing when we commemorate? How do we think about the past? And so this is a question that drives my teaching that makes me really excited about this project.
You mentioned something, your focus on credibility of
Mm-hmm.
sources. Now, that is definitely something that is involved in politics today in newspaper work. Would you have said that was something, how did that develop within you?
Teaching argument, teaching research to first-year college students, it's always been a question of credibility is always something that you address in teaching research. And that's something that getting first-year students interviewing people and surveying people and then comparing that to academic research is something that's always been interesting for me. But it really was last summer that this question of why do we remember the past? What does commemoration mean when we go and look at statues, when we go and look at cemeteries, when we look at books even, what is it? How do we choose what to remember? Why are we doing this? That's really kind of come to the forefront in my teaching, especially because I do teach so much about Southern studies. It's not to say that the rest of the country isn't also the idea of commemoration isn't also as important, but it seems to be, as always, the South is kind of acts as a focus for the things the rest of the country is trying to figure out. It tends to come to a head in the South more focusedly.
Let's see. You didn't mention your least favorite.
My least favorite part of my job, probably grading. Dealing with. I just had a student plagiarize. I think it's just the regular amount of the boring parts of the job that then get me to the fun parts of the job. I just gave a midterm and I said, half sarcastically, half seriously to my students, I want to give you I'm not trying to trick you, I want to give you the opportunity to demonstrate what you have learned, right? I said half sarcastically, but that's also like what I really do want them to get out of it. And I try to remember that when it's, 12:30 in the morning and I've got midterm grades due the next day, So that's the hard part of my least favorite part of the job is the paperwork and the grading, and then that part of the job.
Choosing this profession, how did you choose this profession?
Well, I came back to school. It took me 17 years from my starting college to finishing my bachelor's degree. Growing up, I lived in Atlanta. We moved to Ohio my senior year of high school to a really, poor steel town. I ended up at the University of Cincinnati, just kind of flailing around. My parents got divorced about that time, and so I just kind of ended up, after a couple of years, dropping out of school and working secretarial jobs. And I met my husband in Cincinnati. We moved to New Orleans in 2000 because both of us had gotten moved to Ohio when we were in high school, and neither of us ever really liked it. We visited New Orleans in February once, and going from Ohio to Louisiana in February is delightful. And it was a really wonderful place to live. We lived there for 5 years, and while I was there, I became active in the poetry scene, and there was the women's poetry conspiracy that I helped run. And while I was there, they had the Women's Studies Association came and had a conference, and I got an activist scholarship to go to this conference. I was working as a secretary at Tulane Hospital at the time, and I went to this conference and I saw people giving papers on books that I'd read. I'd read all the things they were talking about. I had, especially working as a secretary, I had a lot of things to say, so I'm like, I could do this. So I started going back to school at night in New Orleans, and then 2005 was Katrina, and my husband and I ended up moving to Tennessee at that point, and I got a job as a secretary at the law school and finished my degree mostly part-time, working as a secretary. My last year of school, I got an English scholarship, and I was able to quit my job and get a student archive job, which was really fantastic. And at that point, that was, I had 17 years. I got my bachelor's degree and just applied to UT grad school and got my master's there, and then went on to Louisiana State University, where I got my PhD in English. And, at that point, being in my 30s in graduate school, I'm very glad I did it that way, because I wasn't worried about dating or things like that. I was like, this is what I want to do. I'd spent my time out of school reading and doing the kind of work, doing volunteering at Planned Parenthood and doing things like that. So by the time I got to graduate school, I had a pretty clear idea of the sorts of things I was interested in doing.
When you talk about your education and you talk about Planned Parenthood, they seem to be very much connected.
Mm-hmm. Well, so starting when I was in high school, I worked as a volunteer at Teen Helpline in Gwinnett County. In fact, we were in Gwinnett County, Georgia. We were made 48 Hours, the TV show. We had the highest teen abortion rate in the country at that point. It was around 1988 or 87 or so. Because it was a very affluent county, and there was zero sex education. So that's always kind of influenced me. If there's a problem that needs to be done, I want to see what I can do to solve it. And that was something that I worked really hard on, was Teen Helpline, because there weren't the kind of resources in school that we needed. And just continuing, it just seemed kind of very part of my life of women needing stuff. I've been thinking a lot about it. I just finished the book 90s Bitch by Allison Yarrow, who's from Macon, Georgia, that looks at the bitchification of women in the 90s. It looks at Anita Hill and Lorena Bobbitt and Monica Lewinsky. And I graduated from high school in 1991, so Anita Hill and the Kennedy rape trial, that was all very galvanizing to me politically. In my first year of college, there was an anti-choice protest that I went and got myself, in the counter-protest and got on the news for doing that. So it's always just been issues of women's autonomy has been something that I've always been aware of.
So, when you think of the, well, I might have to remind you since it's been several years now, when you think of the unity principles of the march, and if you want to, I can go over them if you need a refresher, because I do. Which ones were you drawn to?
Well, it was the March for Women, right, was the title of it, and it seemed so, that moment in time seemed so, like there was so much galvanizing hope, right? We were talking about the word hope of the day of the election. I went to school wearing white and had on blue stockings as a reference to blue stockings, which only I got as a reference, but, and we got up so high and then it was just, a crash. And I thought a lot about, here's one of those segues, but in the early 90s, the author Leslie Feinberg, who wrote Transgender Warriors, and the book that came before that was Stonebridge Blues. She was, her partner was Minnie Bruce Pratt, who's a really amazing poet. Leslie Feinberg came and talked in Cincinnati when I lived there, and talked about Stonebridge Blues and Transgender Warriors. And she talked about how that the lesson of the 60s is solidarity, that you show up for everybody else, that she herself identified as a lesbian and was very active in feminist protests, but she also showed up for civil rights protests and anti-war protests, and that for her, the big lesson of the 60s was you need to show up for each other. And so I was particularly conscious of that thinking about this march, that there were a lot of us that needed to show up for each other. So I think that's related to the unity principles.
And speaking of march, tell us about the other marches you participated in.
So in 2004, I lived in New Orleans, and my Unitarian Church and Planned Parenthood sponsored 3 buses that went from New Orleans to DC for the March for Women's Lives in 2004. And so we got on a bus I forget even what day it was. We got on a bus in New Orleans and slept overnight on the bus, and the next morning we're in DC. We got off the bus and marched, and then had dinner, and then got back on the bus and went back to New Orleans. But it was such an incredible experience for me. I mean, I think one of the good things about marches is the feeling of not being alone, the feeling of seeing that sea of other people who are turning out together. It can be a really hopeful feeling to see so many other people joining you.
Together, yeah. So when you went to that march in 2004, when you went to this march in 2017, and the others,
there was I forget what year it was. There was one. It was when I lived in Baton Rouge. So it was between 2010 and 2014. But I think it was in response. There were marches. I mean, they were smaller, but they were particularly in response to the really anti-choice legislation and all of those, especially around the Southeast, where it was like every other day there was another proposal for transvaginal ultrasounds and all of those things. So I forget what year that was, maybe 2012 or so, but there was a demonstration in downtown Baton Rouge that I went to for that.
How would you compare the impact that you wanted to the impact you see from 2017 to 2019, from 2004 to 2019?
That middle one, I actually really got. I was kind of disgusted by it. The 2004 one was very much my first time being around. I mean, thousands and thousands. I mean, there have been estimates that it might have been 1 million people at this place, and that was so exciting and got us very ready to go fight. And also turning out going, look at how many of us there are here. And also just going and making a march, and we got right down back to the mall as Carole King started singing I Feel the Earth Move, and it was just this very exciting kind of feeling. And the one in 2017 also felt, again, look at how many of us there are. This is huge. We can't be, it was this feeling of, you can't stop this, right? Look at how many people are willing to turn out and saying different things, right? I mean, even the 2004 March, the Catholics for Choice were a huge group that I did not expect to see. I mean, it was really opened up my eyes to see how many people were willing to come out and say things. And 2017 also felt like, look at how many of us there are. I feel a little safer. Safety was certainly, I think, a thing that I felt. The one in between I actually got, I felt kind of disgusted about, because I felt like, at that point I felt like a march was just kind of like a release valve. Like, instead of doing anything productive, we'll just go and we'll yell and we'll feel better after yelling and then go back home and nothing will change. So that in-between one, it just felt like nothing's going to change, going and yelling isn't going to change. But it felt like both 2004 and 2017, because they were so huge, felt like it was making a statement. It was making a statement. Those of us there got to have an experience of feeling safe, right? Look at how many of us there are. Police along the route were waving and happy and supporting us. So there was a really nice feeling of safety that I felt at both of those that was good for me.
Could you elaborate on safety, what you mean by safety?
Well, so especially as a woman, having somebody elected to President of the United States who then nominates the Supreme Court Justice, there's this people who are willing to say things like women enjoy being grabbed by the pussy, the things that at the Supreme Court confirmation hearings. It's terrifying. It's especially terrifying as a woman to think that people are okay with this happening. And so being in a group of people going, no, we're not okay with this happening. Especially, I mean, that's why the symbolism of the pussy hat was so huge, because it was a direct pushback to, no. And so being that feeling of solidarity was a really nice change.
Since you brought up the pussy hat, why don't you were making them?
Yes.
Right? All right, tell us a little bit about that.
So, yeah, it's funny, in this past January I went to go find a pussy hat and I have none, because I made so many and gave them away. I've been knitting since I was about 8. So when I saw the first pattern, I went, I gotta do this. So I started making them, and I put on Facebook and told my friends, if you want one, make a donation to Planned Parenthood and I'll send you one. So I think I ended up making around 20 and giving them all away. And I had one for the march. But the interesting things to me were, we were talking about just wearing them out in public. I lived in Atlanta at the time, and I took Marta to work, and sitting and knitting with that hot pink yarn on Marta it was almost all positive. Like, that's wonderful. Good for you. I'm happy to see that. And I was going to say something. So yeah, I made so many of them that I don't have any left. The other thing that was interesting though is when I put on Facebook, hey, if you want a hat, I'll send you one. It's been interesting how, especially around this march and the visual things around this march, on social media, I was able to identify the people in my family who are closet liberals, right? The cousins who asked me to make them one, that I was surprised that they would ask for a hat. So it's almost like a visible kind of symbol of solidarity that I've really been happy to see. So I think that's one of the things that it's done is allow people to, like a secret code, except not so secret, but a code of like, yes, we're in the same, we're together.
Okay. So we've touched on this, but why did you march? What was your big motivation, your big emotions? What was the first reason you decided to march?
I think it was this. There are two different motivations, but they're connected. One is we need to show that we're our opposition, right? We need to show there's a lot of us who are really unhappy about the presidential election and the direction that the country seems to be going in. So that was the first thing, was we need to show, I want to help make the picture look big, but also I need to go and spend a day yelling. And so, but they're both, to me, they're about visibility, but I realize that it's as much about the visuals of it in the newspaper as it is my own need for a feeling of release and solidarity.
So which march did you attend?
I attended the one in Atlanta.
Who traveled with you?
I went by myself. I lived in Buckhead. I just got on MARTA that morning, and I mean, it was really fun, right? You go to the MARTA station on a Saturday morning, and there are families, there's everybody with signs. It really was a feeling of, anytime you go to an event on MARTA, and you kind of feel like you're among your tribe. So it was, so seeing families, especially Buckhead families, was really fun to see. And I just went down, and the interesting thing to me is I went down just by myself, and by the time I got there, I think I ended up seeing probably 10 or 12 people I knew. I ran into some of my friends from school, so, you know, we all ended up walking together quite a bit of the way. But yeah, I just went by myself.
So when you got up that morning and got ready for the march, what were your expectations?
I was hoping to have a 2004 kind of experience of like, yes, we're here and this will be exciting. I admit I felt some trepidation because you never know. You never know you might get shot. You never know there might be a bomb. I expected there to be hecklers. And in fact, the march in 2004, there were hecklers, but the march was organized very well so that there were always people in front of the heckling people. And the dynamic that my husband and I have, my husband Mark, he is very much the introvert. When I used to do performance poetry, he was my roadie. He's I want to set things up. I once protested Tipper Gore appearing at a place, and he made me a t-shirt, the protest t-shirt, and I wore it out. And so for this thing, he did the wording on my signs, right, so that it was all straight, because he's good at that sort of thing. And he's like, and I will be here, so if you're arrested or whatever, you tell me, you know. And so we have a very good, I'm the person with the microphone and he's my roadie kind of relationship. So we went through okay, we have all my stuff, if anything bad. I mean, I really didn't expect it to happen, but I wanted to be prepared.
So you jokingly said, I'll be here, and he said,
Yeah.
I'll be here if you're arrested.
Yeah.
How did he mean that? How did he say that? Did it come off as flippant? Did it come off as serious?
Both, yeah. I mean, I wasn't planning on doing anything particularly, I wasn't planning on getting arrested. It isn't like, you know, so in addition to this kind of protest, I also went to one of the Moral Mondays in Raleigh several years ago when I was visiting there, and so we went to the Moral Monday there, and there was a group of people there who went there with the intention of, we are going to be arrested as a form of civil disobedience. It was a very orderly kind of civil disobedience, but it was planned ahead sort of thing. And so I understand that that's a strategy of some sorts of things. I knew I was not doing that. But I also know, you know, I'm reading the new Colson Whitehead novel right now that's about somebody who was, you know, got in a car hitchhiking, and it turned out it was a stolen car, and ends up, you know, in prison. And I know that these things happen. I know that my white skin and demeanor often protects me from such things. But I also know that there is no telling that there's always the chance that I could get arrested. Which is why one of the many reasons why my mom was very unhappy with my behavior.
So, this is a little bit of rehashing, but to put a point on it, what issue was most important to you?
Autonomy. I mean, that's kind of the big umbrella term that I use for it. Primarily women's autonomy, but there's so many other aspects of autonomy that this is all underneath. The right to be able to lead a harassment-free life. The ability to bodily be in places and feel safe about that. The ability to access medical care upon, you know, using my own judgment and not having to deal with the myriad restrictions that keep being brought down upon women's bodily autonomy. But also just the autonomy to feel like I'm safe in the world. So that's kind of like the big broad term that I think of this all underneath.
So as you were marching, what other issues did you see represented there? And what did you think about some of the ones you
There
saw?
were really pretty much anything. There was plenty of environmental issue signs. There were certainly direct things about abortion, access to abortion. There were things about marriage equality. There were things about lesbian identity and trans identity and gay identity. That, again, I see this all kind of like as we have a right to live in the world and be safe. To me is kind of like the overriding heading on all of this. And I know some people have expressed frustration of like, no, you need to be on brand and you need to decide what that brand is and what that message is. Then on the one hand, I sympathize with that, you know. But on the other hand, to me, it does all come down to autonomy.
How about, so as you're marching, what were some of your emotions before, during, and after march?
When I, again, a little bit of trepidation and excitement, all the same, you know, all mixed up together. When I got to the MARTA station in Buckhead and seeing the people there, that started just being exciting, you know, and then getting on the train and going down was exciting. It was also kind of rainy and kind of icky outside. So going, after you got off the MARTA stop, there was actually kind of a walk to get to the park where they had the beginning thing. And there was certainly just a part where it was just like a bit of confusion and a little bit of confusion, but once we finally got there and saw everybody there, it was just really a feeling of relief and happiness to see so many other people there. At the beginning of the march, John Lewis got up and spoke, and I just continued to be so fortunate and proud to have John Lewis being my representative when I lived in Atlanta, and that was very encouraging. I mean, John Lewis to me is so inspiring, and seeing him talk about anything, it's just like, yes, you did all that stuff. Of course I need to show up for this. And then, like I said, it was really neat along the route as I suddenly saw lots of people that I know. Atlanta's such a huge place that, and being in a crowd that big, it was nice to see people that I knew. And then, you know, shouting chants and marches and those sorts of things was really, again, both a release for me of, you know, I've been really mad. It's really good for me to yell. And a feeling of solidarity along the way. There were hecklers along the street, but it was also nice to see how many people who would just, you know, be coming out of a restaurant who would clap, or see police who were so like smiling and happy and supportive. That was also really encouraging. No, go ahead.
So you said you did see some hecklers. Anything that stuck with you about that?
You know, the funny thing, both the hecklers there and then later when I posted all of my happy pictures on Facebook, some of my extended family were, you know, you guys should be at work, you know, and I'm like, first of all, it's Saturday. It's why we have the march on a Saturday, because many people don't have to work. So there were a couple of people yelling, get a job, which I just thought was not that effective. And again, then my aunt on Facebook going, I can't believe all of these terrible people who are cutting off work to do this.
Did you ever find out where they got that from?
I assume the media they consume, which is probably very different from the media that I consume. But yeah, again, Saturday afternoon.
You said two questions. One, can you describe the people that you saw there who were marching beside you? I mean, besides your friends, and Chance.
So it was really, there were kids, there were they seemed quite diverse ethnically. I also, the like cultural references on the signs, there were so many, like the Princess Leia, A Woman's Place is in the Resistance signs, cultural references to Star Wars and comics, but also Audre Lorde and Alice Walker. And so I liked the cultural diversity that I saw just in the signs. When I first got there, I started talking to an older couple of white women who are probably near 70 who are talking about, you know, how many marches they've been to. And those are the people who I like talking to at a march. Like, yes, tell me stuff. So that was really cool. But yeah, it seemed like a decent cross-section of Atlanta that I was at.
The crowds, can you describe them as far as your experience within the crowds as opposed to the people there? But how did that feel?
Yeah, it felt safe. It felt like, hey, we're all in a crowd and we're all, so trying to think of the specific chants at that march. I'm thinking things like, well, I think there was a hey, hey, ho, ho, Donald Trump has got to go kind of chant. But there was also things like, this is what democracy looks like, which is one of my favorite things to chant. And I definitely tried to get that one started a lot. So those are the two that really stick out to me.
Let me see, I think let me see, these are about traveling. So when you got there and you met up with your friends, did you stay with them?
For the most part, so I didn't actually like run into them until we started walking. It was there were so many people there at the Atlanta one that they had to stagger the starting, you know, because, okay, so you people down here, you start walking, and I think it was a good like half an hour before like those of us where I was started walking, and then friends I saw the next week were like, oh, we were even farther back than you were, so it was an hour before we actually started walking, which is great. But so it wasn't until I started walking and then I saw some people that I knew, or I saw some people over off there. I'm like, well, I'm not going to make it over there. That I walked with most of them. I think by the time I met up with my friend Matt, who was at Georgia Tech with me, and he and I went to LSU together too. So I didn't know he was coming, and I think his was a last minute decision to show up. So by the time Matt and I saw each other, we spent most of the march walking and with each other and a couple of other people from school. When we got to the end of the march, there were some speeches and things like that, but at that point I was so tired and just wanted to go, and I had some crackers and water with me that I just was ready to go home and have a snack. So I didn't really stick around for the end part.
When did you start connecting with the other marches, either through social media or through the news or something?
Which other marches?
Finding out what was going on in DC, New York, and Boston, and LA, and just around the world.
Really. I mean, beforehand, I think most of this I saw on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter. I had friends who were going to DC for this, and so I'd seen them posting even the night before about like plans of, man, the study of the stories about the subway in DC were just insane. But you know, that happened to me in 2004, before iPhones. I mean, I just had a flip phone, and flip phones weren't, that day they weren't working because there were so many people there you couldn't actually get your cell phone to work. And I got separated from my group when I was there, and I had to find my way on the metro by myself. But there were other people from the march who were like, oh yes, here's what you do. And again, there's this great feeling of that you can just like walk up to somebody and ask them a question and they'll help you. But as I was, again, we had the half an hour wait before we could even start walking. I was taking pictures and posting pictures and looking at other people's pictures, and it was a nice feeling of and it was happening around the world too, right? I saw the New York Times is posting pictures from Paris and things like that. That was just, it felt like really good to be a part of something so big.
Now, as you were going through this, was there any point that you became particularly emotional?
I think when John Lewis got up and started talking, he gets up and starts talking about, and it really, I have such admiration for him, that seeing him talk and thinking about, you know, the physical, what he had physically gone through was really intense. And in fact, too, I had just been in DC, actually, the week before, I think. It was before the inauguration. Georgia Tech had sponsored a couple of group of buses of faculty and students that we went to. They had just opened the African American History Museum in DC, and so I took a bus up there with students and went to the African American History Museum. And seeing the exhibit about John Lewis and what he went through, in a museum and then seeing him speak, that I think was the most emotional moment for me of going, of it's this kind of like double feeling of, I'm proud to be part of something so big, it's important to do something, it's important that I'm doing this, but oh my God, how long are we gonna have to keep doing this? You know, this double feeling of, I'm really glad that it's important that we need to be doing this, but are we ever going to go to a point where I don't have to spend a Saturday out marching but again, we weren't being hit by billy clubs, you know, so perhaps that's progress.
It's funny when we think not being hit by billy
Yeah.
clubs is progress. But, so after the march, what did you think about the media's coverage of it?
I was pleased with the media's coverage of it. It was especially interesting to compare it to the 2004 coverage that was my first time in like a big sort of thing, and it had been such a completely positive experience, and everybody there was so positive, and the coverage I saw of that showed like what looked like angry women, and seemed about anger, and I'm like, that wasn't there. This seemed much more fair to me, at least what I saw of it, and I looked at the Times and the Atlanta Journal, and the Washington Post and things like that. Like I said, I saw a couple of people on social media going, oh, look at those people who need to be at their jobs, and that I just thought was kind of ridiculous. But so I was pretty pleased with the coverage of it.
So when you wake up the day after the march, what were your thoughts as you absorbed?
I was proud that I did it. I was proud of taking part in it. I think I didn't have the kind of like crash come down that I'd had in the past. I still felt like, okay, there's a chance that the next 4 years aren't going to be as terrible as I fear that they might be. Tempered, but you know, still.
So when you were having conversations about with other people about marching,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of questions were you getting? What kind of responses were you getting?
Trying to think of the people that I didn't. So a lot of people, it was exciting to the next week, like talk to people who were also there, you know, so it was nice to see like just how many people had been there. And I'm thinking like it was especially in contrast to the day after the election. The day after the election at school was just sad and fearful. Well, the first person I saw that day is my friend Michael, who's gay, who's like, I feel in fear of my life now. And so it was a really nice counterbalance to that, which had just taken place a couple of weeks beforehand. I think my husband just wanted to know, tell me about it, how did it compare, how you doing, you know, it was good, who'd you see? But I think, again, for the most part, I just got just basic questions of, you know, well, what was it like, or where were you, or how long did you have to wait before you actually got to march?
Can you compare what you were hoping the march would accomplish several years down the road, where you are now?
I think, so I'm also, you know, I'm very active in the Facebook groups of like Bitches for Hillary and groups like that. And I think this past election, I've seen so many women win office. I definitely see that as a causal relationship there, that march really galvanized a lot of women to either run for office or take part in politics. Even in Macon, there's, so I moved to Macon in that fall in 2017, which is a much smaller place, but they had, I forget what it's called, but they have a group of women who actually took a trip up to Atlanta for the march, and they've since continued working as a political group. They try really hard not to be affiliated with a political party, because Macon is smaller and more conservative, and they worry about alienating people. But they sponsored the Allison Yarrow reading, who wrote the 90s Bitch book that I mentioned. But they've also taken on the campaigning for making feminine hygiene products not be taxed. So they've kind of taken that as like, this is their issue that they're working on since. So I really like that it kind of gave people who maybe have never taken part in a political thing, it was a rewarding experience and has allowed for these, whether huge things like women running for office or the smaller, making campaign with the Georgia legislature. I really take a lot of find things like that really hopeful.
The empowering
Mm-hmm.
aspect of it is good. Let me see. This is a little bit hard, but how do you think the march has impacted the political landscape? We've talked
Mm-hmm.
a little bit on that, on the national level,
Mm-hmm.
and then of course that was an
No, I do. I think that this past election has been a positive thing. It's also, though, what Madeleine Albright and so many other women have said about, women need to stick together, right? That it's also, for me, this is something that it's one thing to know something, it's another thing to really have it highlighted of just how many primarily white women who dug in their feet and who don't feel a part of this solidarity are willing to vote for the convicted child molester in Alabama, or continue to show support for the president, or show support for Kavanaugh, right? That it's kind of, to me, on the one hand, people who perhaps thought of themselves as apolitical before, who didn't have experience, could be empowered, but it also seems to have, made another small, what I hope is a small segment of people dig in their heels that much more.
Now, when you hear about the Me Too Times Up and the March for Our Lives,
Mm-hmm.
how do you tie those movements with what happened in 2017?
I think, it's making me think of, there's a La Tigra song called Visibility, right? So, post-Riot Grrrl band La Tigra, that visibility is really important, seeing yourself represented, and the first time somebody goes, hey, this thing happens to me. I mean, that's what consciousness raising was about in the 70s, of just having somebody go, this thing happened to me, and being able to go, oh my God, me too. And for me, Me Too did a similar thing, that people started being visible about things that had happened to them, and then women or men, people who thought that they were alone in their experience, who were ashamed of their experience, the more that you see that you're not alone in that, I think the more that gives you courage to speak up or go, this needs to stop being okay.
Well, that is about all the questions I have. Is there anything else that maybe I didn't touch on? It's kind of interesting for me to do these interviews. There were some right after, and now years later.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
it's a different interview. So
yeah, I do take. I don't know. It seems like it's, on the one hand, we have so many more women in Congress. On the other hand, Kavanaugh was confirmed in the Supreme Court. That makes me feel like it's 1991 again, and I'm graduating from high school. But on the other hand, Anita Hill is now respected by a lot of people in ways that she wasn't then. Mm-hmm. And now, the thing that was it on CNN, or the thing about the Clinton affair that was just on a few months ago, seeing Monica Lewinsky finally start to get some respect as somebody who shared her name and worked in a car loan department in a bank at that point in time, and had to take calls from used car salesmen who thought it was really funny to make jokes about my name. I feel like maybe it's a spiral, that maybe we're a little bit higher up now, and if more people consider things to be wrong now that people are starting to talk about it. Because I think that in the past it's been easy for people to dismiss things, right? It was easier to dismiss, that's just how men are. And I think that it's starting to be okay. I think that it's starting to be that we aren't, that such behavior isn't okay. And so I try to take a little bit of hope that maybe we're a little bit higher up on the spiral.
Yeah, when I started, I was kind of like, you want something big to happen, and then I've slowly learned since then, it's baby steps.
Mm-hmm.
It's baby steps. You get 2 steps forward, then you get your Kavanaugh.
Well, I was thinking
Then you go
about
back and then-
Susan Faluti's Backlash, which came out in like 1990 or something.
I'm going to have to get you to write a book list for me, because I want to.
So, I read Backlash just, on my own, and it talked about, that after the 60s and 70s, then we got Reagan and all of that going, yeah.
It's just a pendulum swinging back
And
forth.
the other day I was just saying, between like Kavanaugh and Brexit and the acceptance of violence against people of color, we thought the backlash was bad in the 80s. Like, is it just me, or is it that the backlash now seems huger, again, with like Brexit and things like that? And I just, on the other hand, then I always, as a literature person, because I do go to books, I'm like, well, think about Shakespeare. People have always been like this.
Yeah.
I often have to correct I just taught this poem to my students by Jericho Brown called NM, that's about thinking about the older generations of people. And there was a bit of a like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could go back to the good old days when? And Jericho Brown is an African-American poet. And the woman in my class saying this was an African-American woman. And I'm like, well, what point in time do you want to go back in time to? Because there aren't that many that I want to go to as a white woman. And it's a message that I try really hard to both give to my students and to myself of like, no, we need to go forward.
We just got new uniforms last May, and our signature uniform is straight up 1950s. Straight up 1950s. It's beautiful little design and
I'm sure it's
everything.
adorable.
And what we get is a lot of, it's wonderful and nostalgic, and I was like you said, 1950s?
Yeah.
It made me nostalgic. I don't want to go back there.
Yeah.
My life would not be what it is today.
No.
I would have to
The
quit.
hats are cute.
No, it's costume, so you have to,
Yeah.
it's like, think of it as theater or that. But yeah, to your point, you're like, okay, let's stop and think. I couldn't be married, I couldn't have children,
Yeah.
I would have to quit at 32.
Yeah.
And I would have somebody putting their hands in my clothing to make sure I have a girdle on.
Yeah.
So,
Well, or
so
even
yeah,
I saw
this whole, it was better back then, always has that.
I would really like to go to, I saw a sign up for like a fundraiser that was a Gatsby party. And I'm like, I want to go wearing the coveralls, right? I want to go as the guy who gets killed, because that.
Yeah, I worked at the station.
Yes. But yeah.
But yeah, well, I guess everybody in their previous lives were famous people, right?
Yes.
And everybody would have been the rich people at
Yeah.
the Gatsby's parties.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for taking your time.
Oh,
and
thank
talking
you.
this